I'm going
Very good.
to I'm going to start with a very short PowerPoint, and after that I will show just a few small sections in a few different papers. Is that on the screen now?
Yes. Very good.
Okay. Okay, so the key idea here is this idea of convergence. Okay. And so Professor Gu has designed a very nice lecture series. Last semester, a very nice series, and continuing on in this semester. And so it's a great honor to be a presenter in this series, along with these great professors like Professor Petrick and great Professor Chris Ryan, and others. So I feel also, like Professor Gu, very humble and also very happy to share these ideas. I think semiotics is, and I'm going to kind of talk about the sort of the evolution or the history of semiotics and how it has come to be in tourism, because it didn't just happen. Even though semiotics has been around for 140 years, okay, so it's not a new idea, but for tourism it is quite new. But I think the key idea, just like what Professor Gu and I were talking about before the start of the lecture, tourism is all about convergence. We are not like economics or sociology, where we are a pure field of study, a discipline, but rather we are a field of study. So everything we do is about convergence. So we take ideas from business, take ideas from marketing, take ideas from anywhere, and we combine them in order to solve certain problems. Because tourism is something that's always changing. It's always kind of one step ahead of us. And it's a very strange sort of topic. And it takes a lot of effort to find ways to explain. And so one thing I kind of want to talk about today is how this convergence of technology, which we kind of summarize, I think, in terms of communications technology, that's kind of what we're saying when we talk about whatever smart tourism might be. But a lot of the ideas, right, without any theory, without any ideas, it's just a topic. So as smart tourism becomes playing more and more of a sort of a central role in tourism, we need to make sure that we have systematic ways to explain what it is. And that's what a theory is. A theory is just simply a systematic way to describe reality, a way that we can share, right? That we can all understand together. So if I think about what was happening before smart tourism and what was happening before semiotics in tourism research, I would say we have to think about this different idea, which is visual research. So before there was any sort of conversation about semiotics, we were talking about visual research. And in today's semiotic language, we would describe that in terms of Peircean semiotics, which talks about the idea of objects and how we perceive and understand things in the real world and things in the virtual world that surround us. So in terms of visual research, we could divide it into sort of two different periods of time, and so sort of pre-Google and post-Google. Google, I think the company started up in 1999 and slowly started to grow from there. But the thing is, I remember in 1999, our computers, we didn't have the computing power that, personal computers, we didn't have the computing power that we have today. So even though things were happening online, we were limited by certain kind of processing power. But if you think about the idea of visual research pre-Google, I would say that, and it's not Hunter, but Hunt, H-U-N-T, Hunt 1975, I think. There was a paper published, probably the first paper talking about destination image. So there is a connection here when we talk about the visual. Oftentimes we think about the idea of image. So an image is something that is visualized. However, image also in English is a root word for imagination. So there's a link when we talk about the word image. There's a link between the things we see, in other words, the objective world, and what's happening in the mind. So the word image is sort of a the pivotal concept between the exterior world and what goes on in the mind. And that's, as Professor Gu said, maybe these days we have two minds. We have our own physical mind, and then a lot of us, in fact, it's become a common phrase in English. If you're talking with someone and you don't know the answer to a question, you say, well, why don't we Google it? So it's become a common, I don't really like that phrase, but it's kind of become an innate part of our language. So anyway, this whole idea of pre-Google, we're talking about, some people like Graham Dan and other, great professors, they started thinking about how this idea of image and imagination. I mentioned Hunt 1975, but you get into the early 1980s and people are starting to think about image. And so they started thinking about postcards, tourism brochures, travel guides. And they said, here's all this physical evidence of the visualization of things, or even souvenir miniatures, right? So these are representations of a distant reality or a distant landscape. So how could we take all of this physical and material stuff and let's rename it as data? And how could we sort that and find out, get some kind of sense of what types of things that people imagine? So as a tourist, what types of things are being imagined or being imagined for us by marketers and DMOs and so on? So in this sense, we say that early researchers in visual research were taking a social approach. And the social approach means a mimetic approach. And that means you have to physically go out and collect stuff and then sort it. For example, one of my papers, early papers on visual research, I happened to be at a travel expo, exhibition in Montreal, Canada. And so you had countries from all over the world with all their brochures and postcards and stuff. And so I went to every booth and collected all of their material into a big box. And I sent it to Korea. And when I came back from my trip, I started to physically sort that stuff. And I came out with a paper on representations for tourism. So that's a social approach because we don't really have all of this stuff in one place. Early research, I performed early research on sole destination image. I had a research team and we went out to all those, there used to be, I don't know if there are now, but in Insadong or Itaewon, they had these little tourism information booths. So we'd go and collect all this stuff and we'd say, well, this is stuff that is accessible, physically accessible to visitors, and let's sort it. Okay, so that's a mimetic approach. That's a social approach to research. Now, post-Google, now all you have to do as far as these digital representations, these visual images, right? Again, connecting the exterior world with our imaginative mind. Now we have our search engine right there in front of us. So powerful, Google, so powerful. You simply type in your keywords, right? Whatever your theory is driving, and there's all the stuff right there, all possible information. But now it's changed because the authority of the image, the authority of that photograph is no longer the exclusive purvey of the destination marketer or advertiser. You know, it's very expensive to make a brochure or make postcards. But now anybody can take a photo, post it online, and then other people, maybe a tourism marketer sees an image they like, and they copy that and they use it as their own. So now there's this weird transferability of the image, and we're not exactly sure, as we used to be, who the producer of the image is. But with all this computing power and software developments, we can start to take what's called a structural approach to visual research, where the sample is defined, the parameters of the sample is defined by the search engine, right? So it's all possible imagery available online from any platform. It's all right there. And then you can use your sampling procedures to define, you know, how many images you want to use and how you want to analyze it. So anyway, what is visual research all about? Okay, well, the whole point of visual research is we want to establish a kind of visual gestalt. Now, the word gestalt, if you've studied any psychology, and especially like Sigmund Freud, the idea of gestalt is, how do you imagine the total sum of something? So if I say, what is soul? Well, you might think about Kyung University, or you might think about Gangnam, or you might think about the Han River, or you might think about, but those are only little fragments. Is there any way to imagine a gestalt of the entire city at once? Another word we use for this idea of gestalt would be the synecdoche. Synecdoche, again, is the sum of all the parts, right? How do we imagine something? So we're interested in, the only way we can kind of do that is to kind of create these typologies. How many types of images are there, right? And then we can make some kind of...
Professor Hunter.
Yes.
I have a question about the gestalt. Like when you explained to us, is a conversion one the concept of object. But I asking a couple of weeks ago, the Itaewon big accident, and a lot of people killed by accident, and then the soul images suddenly changed very negatively. Before the Itaewon, and soul is one kind of is a progressive and then digitally enabled and smart and something, you know, dynamics by BTS, by what Netflix effect, whatever, but suddenly changing to sad city and very dangerous city, whatever. So the people image is changing before and after Itaewon accident. So yeah, when we construct our gestalt, is changing now, isn't it?
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, in that newer paper, the paper I published in Tourism Management, when I did the on the COVID, I added that concept of chaotic. And chaotic is a word that comes from chaos and order. So order, chaos, order, chaotic. So the thing about, and again, the thing about tourism is it's so unpredictable. So in that paper, what I tried to do is I said, how can we visualize soul before coronavirus and during? So there's a time gap. So, and then again, like you said, this terrible accident or event in, so tourism, the gestalt is always unfolding in time. So in terms of gestalt, there might be, we can form a gestalt in terms of space and in terms of the moment, but in terms of time, right? Things are always proceeding. So the gestalt in that aspect, that aspect of the problem of gestalt, that's why we have things like longitudinal studies, where we could talk about the progression of the sign over time and as it's formed by events. So in other words, each event that happens adds a layer or another dimension to what that image might be. So that's a very interesting thing. So let's say, for example, you develop using visual methods, you develop a typology of something in 2022. You wait 5 years and do a Google search again, the images that pop up are going to be different.
Okay.
And then you could compare, right?
So like your paper about the COVID-19 chaotic, you know, the former government treating very well the COVID-19, which is a very positive image we have, and suddenly changing to negative image because of the accident. So there is another layer. So COVID layer and the Itaewon layer and the longitudinally, when we see what happened to Seoul and South Korea, probably layer by layer is changing, right?
Yes. You know, you can go back in memory and think about Seoul in 1988 and how the Olympics transformed travel policy, and in turn, travel policy affected planning and development and all these things. So you can look backward into the past or forward into the present and things like this. So the gestalt is a momentary thing. It's a momentary thing. So for example, if I ask you to imagine a chair, you might imagine whatever chair you're most familiar with. And then I could say, well, imagine what color it is. How many legs does the chair have? 4 or 3 or 1? Is it, you know, and slowly your idea of the chair, as I give you certain cues, your imagination re-edits the chair that's in your mind. So that's kind of, so Gestalt is a momentary thing, and then time moves on. So very, very interesting. So anyway, that's let's move on to a couple other things. Another problem with semiotics. The first problem is the visual research was limited by the technology at hand in the 1970s and 80s and even 90s. The second limitation was and I remember this very clearly when I was a student in the 1990s. There was a very big problem between certain people who claimed to be quantitative-based researchers and those who were qualitative. And there was a big rivalry, and certain journals would not accept certain kinds of papers, simply would not accept. And so there was this very big gap between so-called qualitative and quantitative, which is kind of a false dualism. But what semiotics does is it moves beyond the question of qualitative or quantitative. It's a completely different way of thinking about how science is performed. So everything from the semiotic view, everything is reduced to the sign. And so the real gap is between what is empirical So it doesn't matter if you claim to be doing qualitative or quantitative research. It's actually, there's no conversation to be had, because in either case, you're dealing with empirical stuff, whether it be a landscape, whether it be a conversation, whether it be an interview, anything that is happening in reality is empirical. And if it's not empirical, what would the opposite be? The opposite of empirical would be metaphysical. And metaphysical is simply what is imagined. So whatever I imagine in my head, right? There's no possible way for me, no matter how much I talk about and describe what's in my mind, right? There's no way that I can reproduce that in your mind. So that's metaphysical. The empirical is anything anything that exists in reality. So yeah.
Like what you explained, empirical is a reality in the real world. So can I say like a case by case experience or case by case, something like a, English expert like a David Hume and John Locke, they mentioned, the experience rather than, the cognition like a Descartes. And the metaphysical is produced by Aristotle. So that is a long the history, metaphysical and physical. Is it the same concept? Something like that?
Well, you could say that the empirical is the physical, and then meta, like Zuckerberg, right? Meta is whatever's beyond the physical.
Beyond, yeah.
So another good example, you mentioned Hume and Locke. You could also mention Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, who wrote a very small but very difficult book called A Critique of Pure Reason. And Kant was a highly kind of a religious man, and he was trying to argue how the imagined can be somehow tangible, and I argued rather unsuccessfully, I think. But the key point here is that when you're doing semiotic research, you're dealing with empirical data, you're dealing with empirical stuff. And so we add another layer dimension to that, like we were just talking about the question of time. So we have empirical stuff, but it's not empirical, does not imply necessarily permanent. Right. So the empirical reality of today in Itaewon is different than it might have been 6 months ago. So the idea of empirical, and so this is a kind of an interesting dimension of doing social research, is things change. We are not dealing with what the physical sciences deal with, which is permanent, more about permanent elemental things. So anyway, in what we're talking about today, in terms of semiotics, I can define it as semiotics. There are basically two stories in semiotics. There's the American semiotics, which we might call the Peircean view. And of course, Americans are kind of a more American academics. It takes a more pragmatic approach to things, whereas the continental, and that means like French and Swiss, Saussure was Swiss. So the Saussurian view is more about linguistic, like words and ideas like that. So we're interested in the more object-based reality. So in terms of Peirce, now the most common thing we see when we read about Peirce is most people don't understand him, and for good reason, because he wrote so many books. And everything he wrote contradicted what he wrote previously.
Oh, I see.
So he was, you know, kind of like we're talking about Itaewon, right? Each event changes what his statements really mean, because he wrote so much, and he was trying to develop the semiotics that could contain all of reality. It could contain all of the sciences, because you could argue that mathematics is a set of signs, chemistry is a set of signs, the periodic table. And so he's trying to create this way, and this was very popular in the 1880s, 1890s, with people who were trying to find one way to see contain everything in the world. So people are very confused by Peirce, and so you'll see almost anybody who talks about Peirce, they'll have a little triangle, and they say, well, if the triangle represents Peirce. That's not really true, because Peircean thought is triadic, but not triangular. So he talks about kind of three different ways of thinking in a triadic sense. Excuse me. First being the idea of experience. Okay, so there's a hierarchy of the sign. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute in regards to affordances. The idea is that there's a lot of stuff out there. So just imagine the last time you took a trip somewhere, and you get off the airplane, and it's just chaos. You know, you get through immigration or whatever, and you finally get to where you want to go. Nothing seems familiar, and it's just a jumble of sounds and smells and light, and nothing seems to make any sense. That's sort of the firstness of the sign. It's an emotional experience. There doesn't seem to be anything that makes sense anyway. The secondness of the Peircean sign is practical experience. So after you've been somewhere for a while, you start to understand, well, I have to go there to get my coffee. I have to go there to get breakfast. I have to go here to catch a taxi. I have to, you know, certain kinds of behavior and cues give me certain kinds of rewards or punishments. And I start to understand how things work. So now we're talking about sign value as empirical. This firstness is inside yourself, right? It's a personal kind of thing. And then the third level, the thirdness of the sign is when, and this is the symbolic level, right? Where it's learned, and there are even rules or protocol that we all share, okay? So another way of thinking about this, which is kind of totally different, and I don't think I want to talk about this today, but the categories of the sign, okay? So there's a hierarchy of the sign, firstness, secondness, and thirdness. There are categories of the sign, which means the thing, and the thing does, and the person that's perceiving it. So you can kind of see how that kind of maps on, not perfectly, but kind of maps onto that idea of hierarchy. There's the pure thing, which doesn't necessarily have any relevance at all to my experience as a human being, right? But there's a second level where I start to see that might be useful in some way. Suddenly that yellow car out there is not just a yellow car out there, that could actually afford me transportation to get from one place to another if I know the rules of how to access that. And then there's a third level where there are, whether spoken or unspoken, there are basically universal societal rules in the way we do things. One way to visualize this is what happened with COVID. Somehow government and whoever, experts and whoever, opinion leaders, develop a whole new game, a whole new set of rules for how we behave in society. Suddenly we have to wear a mask. Suddenly we have to supposedly maintain certain distance from other people. We have to stop certain buildings we cannot enter. Others we can enter, but we have to subject ourselves to you know, temperature reading or something. and then we have to get vaccine, and then suddenly there are these plastic partitions between us. So there's a whole new universe of semiotic science that we have to learn, and it becomes eventually force of habit. You can see how some of the rules imposed on us through COVID have kind of changed behavior. I noticed something very interesting just yesterday in our tourism building. I remember before COVID, if you're on the first floor and you want to catch the elevator, everybody just crowded and just tightly crowded around, like you're in India. Everybody's crowded around the door, ready to push and just crazy getting into the elevator. And yesterday I approached the elevators and I noticed students are all lined up in a straight line with a gap between them, waiting for the elevator. I said, who told them that there are new rules on lining up? Well, it didn't have to be necessarily told. Again, that kind of goes back to the idea of time and Gestalt. The rules change. So that again is this idea of hierarchy of the sign, of firstness, secondness, thirdness, or these three categories. And then the third thing, of course, we have are these ideas of icon, index, and symbol. I don't want to go into this right now, but basically these three are not separate. Something can be both indexical and symbolic. The interesting thing about, I will mention just something about index, because an indexical sign represents the idea of time. So for example, if the classic example is, let's say, a footprint on the beach. Okay, well, there's nobody there, but I see a footprint on the beach. That means somebody must have been there, right? So it's evidence of something happened and time passing. So for example, the tragedy in Itaewon, right? Lots of people died. Will there be flowers put there, or were there, or will there be a little plaque or monument put there to commemorate the event? Then that would be an indexical sign because it's recalling something from the past. A nice idea of an indexical sign would be the Olympic Highway here in Seoul, or the Olympic Stadium. That event is long gone. A lot of our students weren't even born then. So it's like ancient history. However, certain markers exist that indicate, see, index, indicate the empirical reality of that thing that is no longer with us.
Professor Hunter.
So, yes.
Okay, before we next slide, I have a question about the firstness, secondness, thirdness again. For example, let me clarify. Like I driving Benz. So when I see the Benz mark, firstness to me is a car, but secondness is kind of a success or rich. Am I right?
So the first one is it's just a nonsense mark, and it's just a car, like you said. The second is maybe through your experience, maybe somebody who owns a Benz let you drive it, right? And you say, wow, this is really nice. The third might be like the market value of a Benz is higher than perhaps other cars.
That's right? Why the Koreans these days buy German car, Mercedes-Benz and BMW and Audi is a symbolically thirdness. I'm such a class.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the secondness is a mark, represent identity. Is that right?
Well, in terms of thirdness, the Benz can symbolize success and symbolize reliability and symbolize a lot of things, but the mark itself is iconic, right? Because the mark is a representation of itself. So again, like I said, a sign can be both iconic and symbolic at the same time, right? But yeah, your interpretation is correct. Yes.
So like COVID-19, before COVID-19, we wearing the mask is dusty and what the smog or whatever things happen. So we wearing mask, and the mask is suddenly changing to the COVID-19 is like distance, hygiene, security, and sort of things.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So the value of the sign changed because the circumstances wherein you would see a mask have changed. So the sign value.
So it's a COVID-19. Now is the endemic era. So when I want to travel someplace, okay, there's no mask wearing. We feel such a unstable or non-hygiene, something like that. I can be able to, wow, it's long. I want to stay away from other people because they don't wearing mask. But in Western society, like America, probably wearing mask is symbolic, something, terrorist or whatever they don't like, isn't it?
Well, in particularly in at least as I see it in the media, the wearing of a mask has divided American society entirely. Those who wear a mask and those that are called anti-maskers.
Okay.
And you can see videos on Reddit or YouTube of these people fighting, physically fighting. Take off that mask, or the other one says, put on the mask. So it's become this representation of either you obey the system or you are a free individual. And it was quite funny during COVID how many people died of COVID because they refused to wear a mask. So it's quite interesting. Whereas in Korea, I think everybody just basically said, well, it made perfect sense to wear a mask, and it's quite interesting.
Thank you.
I remember the first time somebody said to me, they said, if you're outside without a mask, you could get fined like something like that. And just that rumor was enough to motivate me to wear a mask. I said, well, apparently that's the rule, so follow the rule. So it's really amazing how deeply this COVID-19 has affected society. It's changed us really fundamentally. 2.5 years of this, and in many ways changed us for the better. So what else? And then I'm just a last slide here, and then I want to jump to just a couple things in a couple different papers to show you. I could say it's a problem with semiotics, but I could also say it's an advantage of semiotics. And this has a lot to do with things that Professor Gu has just mentioned. When you're doing research on semiotics, the signs kind of only make sense in a particular research context. Okay, so for example, we're just talking about COVID-19 and the mask, and how the mask, if we're just talking about Korea, how the mask here in Korea has taken on a different meaning, right? Instead of just being something maybe a worker wears or a doctor might wear, everybody's wearing it. So it becomes a representation or a sign of a pandemic. But in the United States, the sign value is totally different. Suddenly it becomes a political problem, right? Is the government in control of us, right? In United States society, there is a significant population that is very anti-government and another that's very pro-government. And so the politics of the mask, right? So in that sense, the symbolic value of the mask, because as we learned, right, before, that when we're talking about signs, they are learned, right? And they become predictive. So if you're to do a study on the semiotic value of the mask in Korea, your results, your findings don't necessarily apply to anywhere else. So in methodology for you students, many of your professors talk about generalizability, right? So in other words, the results are not generalizable. However, they could be replicated. So replication is another way, another path to verification. So if you talk about generalization, you're talking about statistical power, sample size, and things like this. But in a semiotics context, you would have to say, well, okay, this is the way I did the study step by step. Now you go ahead and try doing it in Brazil, right? And see what happens. Do the signs have the same value or do they have a different value? Either way is good because you learn how transferable a sign might be across culture or across geographical context, or and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a minute, or not. And if not, that's also an interesting finding because you can start to explore cultural or geographical difference in terms of the sign value, right? In terms of the hierarchy of the sign, how that opens up the categories of the sign and sign types. So anyway, as mentioned earlier, we can really basically think about semiotic methodology in two ways, as structural or as social. Now, the difference between structural and social, for example, if, as I was talking about with like a Google, okay, so Google means you have a lot of stuff and it's already there and you just identify what type of sign it might be. In other words, it's pre-packaged. So when we talk about a lower level concept, which is the idea of representations, visual representations, those are pre-packaged signs, okay? Those are things that are on this level of maybe practical experience. So in between here, from here to here. But in social semiotics, that's when you go out, like I said, about collecting brochures, or you just go walk around in the streets and look for things. So that might be what we call field work. Methodology field work, where I say, okay, I'm going to give you 2 months, just go walk around Seoul, see what you think Seoul is, take photos, and then we'll sort those. Well, that's on the level of mimesis. So mimesis is a more primal, or it's more about the emotional experience of the researcher between emotion and practical. And then representations are from practical to predictive rules. So, I mean, let's say, for example, the first time I had to go buy a mask, and I remember there was like a mask shortage. There weren't enough masks. But anyway, finally acquiring this mask and putting it on, and I had a kind of an emotional reaction to that. I said, this is kind of a weird thing. Is this really necessary? And because I didn't understand its, the more, predictive and symbolic sense of that thing. So in this sense here, structural, we're talking about representations. So like here, the signs are fixed and prefabricated representations. We don't have to do any of that other work. They're already there as forms, as empirical forms. But on the mimetic level, right, signs are encountered and are mimetic. So kind of like, let's say, for example, Professor Gu mentioned the Benz. If you have never seen a Mercedes-Benz before, and you get in it, and immediately you're hit by like the quality. You're talking about a mimetic experience. And it's only later, once you sort of understand its social and market value, that it becomes a representation. So a lot of stuff that goes on when we're talking about semiotic research, a lot of the work, you know, the front end work of just collecting a bunch of representations or a bunch of mimetic signs and use content analysis to sort, like, here's the mountains, here's the cats, here's the birds. Okay, and it's like, well, you know, anybody can do that. And of course, anybody can. But the real work comes post hoc. Post hoc is Latin for after, right? A priori, a posteriori. So what happens after? So after you have all those signs, the real work starts, where you have to figure out what it means. And then you have to go back to these, the problem of hierarchy, the problem of categories, and the problem of sign types, to interpret and to tell a story about what it means in that context. Again, it's when we're doing, excuse me, when we're doing semiotics, we're not doing some kind of, we're not producing universal findings. So now in terms of as we start to talk, coming back to this idea of convergence, which is the point of this lecture series, talking about convergence in smart tourism. Well, what does semiotics really mean for smart tourism? Well, I've already mentioned probably the key point, which is semiotics has been waiting a long time for technology to catch up to the ideas. I'm sure if Pierce was alive today, he would be absolutely excited with what's happening in technology. So semiotics has been waiting a long time. Smart tourism would not exist without the technology. So the event of all these mobile devices and computing power and internet systems, wireless systems, the technology has afforded us, has given us the opportunity to create the concept of smart tourism. And it's given us an opportunity to say, well, could we take some of these existing theories and methodologies and apply them? So this is the convergence, and it's happened because of technology. And this is where it's very exciting. So new inroads regarding applications are opening up with the maturation of the theme of smart tourism. So, you know, thanks to
Professor.
Yes.
I have a question about the semiotic research require post hoc interpreted work. You know, usually people wish to visit a certain place because of fantasy. Like I want to go France because I saw a lot of movies represent something romantic, you know, scene, something like that. So I have a projection, or I have an expectation toward France, Eiffel Tower. That's kind of a priori. And then I've been to Paris and accidentally bad experience in Paris, stolen my wallet. And post-hoc interpreted work through my experience in Paris is a terribly remind me dirty, the romance essays allowed the pickpocketers, and my post hoc interpretive work about the Paris destination is a suddenly change from my expectation to the practice.
Okay, Professor Gu, let me hold that question for just a few minutes.
Okay.
And then I have a very nice answer to give you.
Okay.
But the key point is, I'll answer part of that question first, or that comment, which is, that's maybe you. But what about 100 people or 1,000 people, right? So just hold that thought for just a minute. The thing is about types, sign types. If you think you've already decided what the types are, you're probably wrong. So content analysis cannot be based on what you think the types will be. It has to be based on what they actually are by the characteristics, or what you define as the characteristics of the sample of the images. But let me just pause on that, and I'll show you a perfect example of what that is. In fact, we can probably just skip this, but leading up to, I'm going to show you a couple of things with a couple of papers. But anyway, with smart tourism, okay, what's happening now is, and Professor Gu has been thinking about this a lot, about sort of moving a focus from the technology itself to the user and real travel events. And this is also part of the conversation of what you just mentioned about going to Paris and what the experience might be. Okay. And then the other thing here is this idea of semiotic forms. We don't need to talk about that. So Max, please help me here. And let's change, let's change the, did we just close that?
There.
Yes. Okay, let's change this
Okay,
screen.
you opened a new file, please sharing that file.
Yes.
Okay.
This one.
No. This one.
This one.
Okay. This is a classic paper here. A very, very fun paper to read. It's called Tourism Imaginaries. And this paper was published way back, I guess not way back, it's 2012. But the idea is much older. This is a more recent paper, but this is a kind of an old idea, and it's not very popular and not very well known in tourism research, called Tourism Imaginaries. Okay, so what does imaginaries mean? It's a strange word, right? The word imaginaries basically comes from the idea of fantasy.
Fantasy. Okay.
The idea of fantasy. So we can see here, it says, imaginaries are complex systems of presumption
Presumption. Okay.
that enter subjective experience as the expectation that things will make sense generally. Okay, so this is kind of like you said. So a tourism imaginary would be one person who says, you know, Paris is a romantic city. And another tourism imaginary would be somebody who says Paris is a dirty city or a dangerous city, right? And then if we go back to semiotics, we could talk about the hierarchy of these imaginaries. So this is another, so here you can see here, it says here, it's hard to think of tourism without imaginaries or fantasies, the original Greek word for imagination. Okay, more playful imaginaries relate to things that are improbable or impossible. So fantasy is somewhere between what might be empirical and what might be simply metaphysical. So we can come down here and we can say, well, what are imaginaries? And let's go right here. Okay, and we see, as we mentioned earlier, Kant, Immanuel Kant, and the idea that imagination is hidden in the depths of the soul. And devices will scarcely let us divine and spread exposed before our eyes. In other words, is the imaginary something hidden, or is it made real? Now, that's whatever, right? That's just talk. But in terms of methods, well, how do we represent the imaginary? And this is a nice idea, tourism imaginaries and smart tourism. It's an interesting potential convergence. So we see here, what might these imaginaries be in real life? And there's a big list. These channels. So he says the imaginary can become visible, right? Imaginaries remain intangible until they become visible in the form of images and discourse. So how does the metaphysical become empirical? It becomes empirical when it becomes visible in images or in discourse, visible or audio or whatever. So anyway, what might these channels be? And you can see a list here: text, movies, art, museum exhibitions, fairs, trade cards, video games. Anyway, you can read it yourself. Photographs, video, postcards, brochures. And then this is the funniest one, right? Quasi-scientific media, such as National Geographic. So anyway, we could say that these imaginaries,
quasi-scientific media, you know.
right? Funny, right?
Yeah. A question again. You know what? BTS is a world-renowned, singer group, and like France, London, any city, the young generation, teenagers, they crazy about BTS. Yeah, their song is okay, very good, and they're dancing very well, just like a copy Michael Jackson, seven men's exactly same way, whatever dancing, and they got fantasy and imagination, and they actualize that fantasy coming to soul, and then they bust. Wow, what the hell is this? The ugly Korean guy like me, and then their fantasy is a bust. So these days, a lot of the Netflix effect, like the funny, interesting, dramatic, story, and then the kind of scenes, like a squad game, whatever. It's a very sad story. It's a big economic gaps and something people dividing each other, kill each other. Representing Korean culture and moment now. But in the scene and the drama, they got the imagine and then like a fantasy, and then people try to actualize through the tourism. So what do you think about K-pop in terms of imagination, in terms of fantasy, as your perspective?
Okay, I don't want to waste our time searching for it, but one thing that this paper mentions is there are as many imaginaries as there are people, right? So, and you can see this is actually a statement from Hollinshead, the business of difference projection. Okay, so if you're talking about, for example, Hallyo in general, Hallyo means a very different thing depending on the audience. And you can think about Hallyo in terms of culturally proximal audiences. So for example, Laos, Vietnam, Taiwan perceive Hallyo in a certain way, maybe via television dramas. Japan perceives in a certain way. China has had a anti-Hallyo stance. In fact, it's weird because China, many people think Chinese journalists invented the word Hallyo.
I see.
From Chinese Hanliu.
Hanliu.
And but they also are the ones now that reject. Another way of perceiving Hallyo is through what are called fandoms. So fandoms are people who have no cultural, no geographical relation at all. They form fandoms or groups online. And those are the people, of course, who have made like BTS and Blackpink into superstars. So the Korean audience might reject the stardom of BTS, but they have this online fandom that is, crazy about them. So, so again, this is kind of like this idea of imaginaries, that no single event has a universal symbolic significance, right? This kind of goes back to the idea of that you can't generalize the symbolic sign value, right? The symbolic value of a sign. This also connects to, as we're talking about semiotics and about this idea of imaginaries, there's also a very important word here that is talked about a lot by people like Baudrillard, who talks about the seduction, the seduction of images, the seduction of discourses. And a discourse, of course, is different than a narrative. A discourse is a conversation. So, for example, the stardom of BTS is maybe not because BTS is all that good or all that exciting, but it's because of the discourse within the fandom. The audience is so enthusiastic that they have created BTS. BTS have not created themselves; they've been created. They're a product of the audience, right? Which is, it's always interesting to think about that in contrast to Psy, right? Gangnam Style, how many years ago? That was like the most viewed video ever on YouTube or whatever. How did that video capture almost a universal appeal, which is unprecedented, right? And I have no answer for that, but I think it's interesting. So anyway, the other idea here, we have imaginaries, and we have another idea, which of course Professor Gu knows, and I'll share the screen here with another one. Here, Professor Gu is very clear about this.
No, wait.
Yeah, share this one.
Wait. This one.
This one, yes. Okay, so we in the context of talking about semiotics and smart tourism, we talked about the idea of imaginaries. So that's what could be there, people's fantasies, and really in a lot of ways that's what smart tourism is designed to accomplish, right? To facilitate the realization of our fantasy, using navigation and using however we use mobile devices to achieve our imagined, our fantasy of travel. Because until you travel, right, until you depart on the airliner, until you depart to France, and you get to France, everything you think you know about France is simply a fantasy.
Yeah.
You haven't actually been there. So once you get there, then you have your experiences either confirmed or discarded, rejected, right? Depending on what happens. So anyway, the other thing here is the idea of affordance. Again, Professor Gu knows all about this. We've talked a lot about this. But the idea of affordance is another idea. It's a little bit older than that idea of imaginaries, but kind of similar in a lot of ways. Okay, so the theory of affordance is, think back to when we're talking about semiotics and the hierarchy of a sign, where something might just be an emotional, an abstract thing in our mind, right? That's the imaginary, right? And then when it becomes recognized and it becomes something that has a use value.
Mm.
Instead of just an imaginary value, it is transformed into something with use value. That's what the theory of affordance is about. So let's talk about the most incredibly primitive most primitive example. Let's talk about a surface, like a floor, or like when you go from a floor and you enter an elevator, that surface is different, right? The floor is fixed, it's very thick, it's very strong, but the elevator, the floor is very thin, and it's mobile, it moves. So when you move from one kind of surface to another, what's going on in your mind? The elevator could fall. The elevator has a weight limit. If there's too many people in it, the elevator could fail. So he's saying that what does the environment offer, or what does the environment furnish? And then he has this example of a surface, and he says a surface, a terrestrial surface, should probably be horizontal or maybe a little bit slanted. It should be basically flat, and it should be big enough in relative size to the animal. So think about an elevator. Why is the elevator the size it is? It's to offer an affordance to more than one person. It wouldn't make sense for our elevators at Kyung University to be so small that they only fit one person. That wouldn't make any sense, right? So the affordance has to be the right size, and it has to be sufficiently rigid. All right. So as far as the surface goes, there are four requirements. It has to be horizontal, relatively. It has to be flat. It has to be big enough in relative size, and it has to be rigid. You know, it's think about everything in our lived environment, our built environment. The car, right? The Benz. Why is the Benz the size it is, the dimensions it is? Because that's the size of people. It has to be, so the car has to be an affordance to the physical reality of us as humans, right? If dogs drove cars, then the car would be have different dimensions, the size of a door, you know. And doors are interesting affordances because for us simple people who live in villas and apartments, the door is just maybe 196 or 200 centimeters tall. But if you're Donald Trump and you live in the Trump Tower, the door might be 4 meters tall. So now it's an affordance not only to allow people to go in, there are no people who are 4 meters tall. So why is the door 4 meters tall? It's fulfilling a different type of affordance, right? It's as in terms of sign value, the door is not just a practical entryway, but now it is a conveying, it becomes a symbol of wealth. It costs more to build a 4 meter tall door than it does a 2 meter tall door.
Professor Hunter, in terms of that elevator size, you know, Chinese people and Korean people is a size similar, or even Korean people follow than the Chinese people. But Chinese, they built a huge castle, Tiananmen Square, and something like that. It's a huge one. You know why? Chinese like a huge one? No, they want to show the huge building for we are the big country. So Bao's, that's why they built the big castle, big Tiananmen, something like that, representing you are the neighboring countries is a small size, and you coming to China and Bao, I am an emperor of the big country. So even though the size of human body is similar or even small, but they built huge building. That's their concept.
Right. So it's a representation of power.
Okay, right.
Representation of power. I thought you were
So
going
like
to
a
say,
Kyung University, the building, my image is that representation of the old building and Gothic and the French style and the European style. What does the European style stand for? It's a genuine, authentic, something like that way. So Gyeonggi University, they want to show other people we are genuine, well, we are authentic, we are westernized, or something like that.
we are global. And it's also interesting, the peace building. Not many people really go there. It sits up there on the hill as a
It's for building by looking.
Yes, it's icon. It's an icon.
Mhm.
It's very interesting. You know, speaking of affordances, when you first mentioned elevator and maybe Chinese or Korean people being relatively small, I was going to say that, you know, it's very funny and interesting. If I haven't been to United States for many years, but it's interesting how everything is getting bigger in the US.
Okay.
And the proportion of, I'm a pretty fat guy too. I'm much too fat, but you can see Americans are becoming very fat.
Becoming
And so they have problems with like air travel. The seat belt is too short. So they need to provide like an additional seat belt to link the two parts together. The seats are too small. Right? People can't sit down. They're too big. And if you look at cars, cars are getting bigger. They're huge. They're the size of vehicles, especially over, let's say, the last 10 years, they're huge. Because they have to fulfill their purpose as affordances, right? So that's why I like this one. It says where is it? It says here, where it offers the animal, it affords, where is it? Relative to the size of the animal. See? Oh, and also,
so what
like,
do you think? The car is getting bigger, but
Yes.
airplane should be the same size. So
Well,
people are traveling by airplane.
Well, the trouble with air travel is that you have people in power who want to make money. So they don't necessarily have to provide the affordance, right?
Oh,
So,
I see.
a little bit different. Not necessarily, they're interested in how much money they earn per seat. So it goes against the interests of an airline to make the seat bigger. Right. So instead they just give fat people these seatbelt extenders.
Okay.
So they could fit inside the oh.
Okay.
Okay, just real quick here, a couple more things. Go to this DMZ paper.
Okay.
I'll show you another paper, just a little bit. DMZ is okay. I can move it here and it won't change, right?
Yeah,
Okay, reshare. Okay, you can see that this is, it says up here, Hunter DMZ to Dokdo.
Okay. You are ambassador of Korea.
Well, this paper, I don't know what I was thinking at the time, but this was quite a few years ago. So, you know, for the benefit of students out there, if you see a paper that says 2015, okay, that means the paper, the contents of the paper are probably 2013. So everything that we read and everything we see is, there's a delay or a lag between the idea, the writing the thing, and then it actually being available to the reader. So, you know, so that's quite a long time ago. That's 2013, that's 10 years ago. So I can't really remember even what happened yesterday, but 10 years ago, for some reason, I was thinking about borders. And there's a lot of literature in tourism about border theory. And so I said, and I was, I've always been thinking about representations. And I thought, well, what about combining this idea of border theory with tourism representations? So this is another thing I would direct to students, is that, our world is becoming, I really respect students because they are living in, a very highly competitive world. So how do you distinguish yourself from all your competitors?
Okay.
You have to be creative. The way you're creative in tourism is to really study tourism and study all these different theories. Anything is available to you.
Okay.
Affordance theory. What's the other one we talked about? The imaginaries, order theory, pilgrimage. There's just so many different things. And then how do you combine with methodology? So there are infinite numbers of combinations of things. So anyway, I thought, okay, and then of course the third thing you need is a context. So I said, okay, let's think about Korea. And there's two very fun topics in Korea regarding borders. One would be the DMZ, which is a artificial border. And in terms of border theory, there are natural borders, so like a mountain, an ocean, a river. Okay, and then there are arbitrary borders, which are just a straight line. So DMZ is 38th parallel. It's just, we all sat down and said, draw the line. So if you look at the map of Africa, the continent of Africa, you can see some borders are irregular because of, for example, Lake Victoria, Rwanda and Kenya and all these countries, that divides, that's a divider. Or many countries just have these straight lines. And that means somebody sat in a room with power and drew a straight line on the map. So that's
the English. The French and English.
Well, in Africa, Italians colonized Ethiopia, the Germans, French, English, everybody had a hand in it, still do. Now, of course, the Chinese. Okay. Okay. So anyway, and then you have something like Dokdo. Okay. Which and Dokdo is a border marker. And the reason it is because we have like what's called international maritime law, which means, like, let's say there's an ocean, whatever is equidistant. So the problem with Dokdo is it's unlucky because it's right exactly in between Japan, and it's right in the middle of the East Sea. That's why it's controversial. So if you think about, like, how did World War II start between Japan, that side of it, Japan and US? Japan bombed Hawaii. Why? Hawaii is exactly in between United States and Japan.
Oh, I see.
As far as Japan was concerned, they said, you know what? I think Hawaii, so Hawaii is Japan's Dokdo, see? So they thought, I think Hawaii should be considered, part of Japan.
I see.
That's a lot of the conflict with what's happening in China, not necessarily interested in the Philippines or these things, but they're interested in the
Sengaku?
The waters, right? And then you have fishing rights and travel. So anyway, I don't want to talk any politics on that, but what I thought was interesting is we have these two different kind of borders.
Okay.
Could we use semiotics to kind of explore how these two different representations? So you can see, well, we have this border up here. Doesn't look like a straight line, but I think it's supposed to be a straight line, isn't it? And then over here we see Uleungdo, and then we see Dokdo over there. Okay, so we say, whatever's in between here, number 7 is the Tsushima.
Tsushima. 대마도.
So I kind of drew a line there, right? So that's kind of like this water is Korea's and this water is Japan's. But what happens here, right? So we have these two different kind of borders. So they have very different characteristics. Are there, using semiotics, could we explore what's shared in terms of border theory? How do they both work as social constructions, right? So a border as a social construction rather than a border as a geopolitical boundary. So how does it become a symbolic representation of here and there, or us and them? So that would
see.
the question. Right?
Okay. Look at that. The Ukraine war. The
Yes.
Ukraine tried to be part of the European continent, EU, and then Russia hate that, and then the war happened because of that border,
Right.
political border.
And it's like, let's take a little bit, let's redraw the line, right? And then conflict arises from that. That's very, very interesting.
Oh, very interesting.
So, you know, one thing I noticed, and I'll just mention this before I show just a couple more details and then I'll stop. But one thing I noticed, and I've been to both places numerous times. One thing I noticed about both DMZ and Dokdo, okay, another characteristic of borders is that there are borders you can cross and borders you cannot cross.
Okay.
So in other words, if I want to travel to Japan, I cannot go by boat to Dokdo and then straight over to Japan. I can't.
Okay.
That border cannot be crossed. DMZ, I cannot go from Seoul to Pyongyang. So it's an uncrossable border. Other borders, like in, let's say, for example, in Europe, you can sit at a coffee shop and you can see a yellow line on the pavement, and you can be one leg in two different countries because the borders are very, very porous. So anyway, what the thing I want to say as far as borders as social constructions is, what I find is a lot of people like to go to DMZ and do what? They like to go to the DMZ and look across the border, or maybe with some binoculars or a telescope, and they get very excited to say, over there is North Korea. And a lot of people go to Uleungdo here, and there's a place on Uleungdo you can climb up, a little bit of a mountain, and they also have these, and you can stare out across the sea, and you can say, oh, there's Dokdo. So this idea, even though I cannot cross, there's a fascination with looking across the border. So anyway, employing semiotics. And let's go back to that PowerPoint I showed at the very beginning of the lecture about representations. If you're still not sure what representations are, in this paper, I've provided a very nice 5-point definition. So we could say that representations, number 1, are empirical, as we talked about earlier, empirical objects and true descriptions, indexical to reality. So you see how that idea of index is included here. So indexical to reality means that there's evidence of its presence. So in many ways, we could say borders in many ways are indexical, because at some point they were made. All borders are artificial in the sense that they are social constructions. So they're evidence of past action. Another definition of representations would be deceptive or exaggerations or distortions of reality. So in this sense, we could say stereotypes, right? So again, if you reduce the reality in terms of imaginaries, if you reduce the reality of Paris to dirty or dangerous or romantic, it's deceptive because it's much more, it includes all those dimensions, right? Depending on what's happening at the moment. So representations can be deceptive. Representations are objects of commercial exchange.
Mhm.
So in terms of tourism imaginaries, every fantasy as a traveler, any fantasy you might have, somebody has already predicted
Mm.
and has already packaged that
Mhm.
to sell to you.
Okay.
Okay. And the other one here would be elements of the commoditization process. So in other words, these are the small things, right? Small commodities, and all combined together become part of the process of commoditization. Okay. In other words, selling the destination as a whole.
Mhm.
That's why when you look at destination marketing, the semiotics of destination marketing, for example, if you just go to YouTube and you type in Korea travel, you'll see all these amazing promotional videos. And what they'll do is they'll go province, they'll be like Seoul, Gyeonggi-do, Jeju-do, and they'll go province by province and show what's special about that province. Well, they have to do that because they are obligated, like a DMO, a destination marketing organization. Where do they get their money? They get their money from hotel tax. So if they do any promotional stuff, they have to represent every part of Korea equally. Okay, so that means that Korea as an entire thing is being marketed as a whole. And then finally, representations might be symbolic signs that affect the self-identity of residents. So they might not even be based on the tourists. But let me just kind of skip down here just for fun. Let's look at how we could represent the DMZ. So here we see something very interesting. If you look at the top 4 representations here, so these are derived from a content analysis based on a structural content analysis. So based on search words driven by Google, and you see soldiers patrolling the fence, and it's very cold and scary looking place. You see the Panmunjom. You see a map with all the dangerous military places. You see Obama here with the soldiers looking across. So it looks very military and very scary. This is how most Americans think of DMZ.
Okay.
And as far as inbound tourists, Americans love to go to DMZ and commemorate. For them, it's a commemoration of the Korean War. It represents violence. It's scary. It's a terrible place like this. But if you look down here, these are, okay, so these are, I got these from my search on the Google. I got these from Naver search. So compare here, here's a scary soldiers and stuff like this. Look down here, beautiful sunset. Even though you see the wire, there's a sense of not necessarily romantic, but there's a sense, there's a peaceful sense. Over here, you see, again, you see the soldiers. Over here, you see people on bicycles participating in recreational activities. The DMZ is a recreational space. Over here, you see, instead of the map of the military spots, you see a map of minbak, hostels, and recreational sites. Here, instead of Obama and soldiers, you see celebrities. So a totally different view of the border. Okay. Down here, you see, I think I've maybe wasted enough time on this. Anyway, this is what I was talking about, gazing, right? So you can see the exact same image. This is Dokdo, this is DMZ. This representation of gazing across, or this image of flagging the border. And this is like flagging the border here as well. Okay, so anyway, let me just finish up and maybe some people have questions.
Yes,
Let's-
yes, please.
Yes, just very, very quickly, and I'm finished. Just 2 minutes. Click on this, share this one. This is the TM semiotic.
Professor, Professor Khu, can you see this semiotic development?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Okay, so anyway, this is that paper that Professor Gu mentioned, the new one that I published in TM. And just very, very quickly, the contribution of this paper is that I employed both structural and social semiotics. Okay, so and I also, so you can see the representation, as I mentioned, is a pre-packaged sign. Mimesis is referring to the experience,
Reality.
of, yes. Okay. So fieldwork versus online. So capturing both sides and capturing pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Okay.
So anyway, I think that's basically enough from me. And I wonder if there are questions or other things you want to talk about.
Okay, students, it's time to give you a question to Professor Hunter. He will kindly reply to your question, I guess. Okay, close the file.
Think about that for just a minute, and then I'll be right back. Sorry. Think about your questions.
Yes. Okay. Please preparing for your question to him, and he will give a very good answer to about today's lecture, especially semiotics, image. It's most essential part of tourism field, image. These days, online image, isn't it? Yeah. Hello, Blue Lane Izati Binti Mod La D. What's your name?
This is my full name. They just call me Nuruline. Yeah.
Nuruline.
Yes.
Okay. Can you ask him?
Yeah, Professor?
Uh,
Can you hear me? Yeah. Since I'm not sure how to say this. Do you since like this semiotic is in terms of like visual representations, do you think like this semiotics like has a lot of influence in terms of the process of place branding? So what do you think about that? In terms of like sustainables, like smart tourism, how like these semiotics can play great roles in like place branding implementations towards the sustainable smart tourism. So like, what do you think about that? Like, is this like, do we have a lot of semiotics have a lot of influence to like for these types of place branding?
Yes, absolutely. We can think about semiotics in two ways. We can think about using semiotics to decode existing place branding. So in other words, if I'm just a researcher and I'm interested in how a place is already branded, right? I can use semiotics to decode the language of tourism, the language of the brand. Now, if I'm a marketer, I could also use semiotic research to devise a new brand, right? To devise a brand that's totally unique. What happens a lot of times, and not always, I'm not a marketer, but in terms of place branding, what happens many times is people will benchmark. So let's say, for example, here we are in Seoul, and we're in a KTO or in some other DMO, and we get around the table, we're in the office, and we say, you know what, Singapore's branding is really exciting. Singapore is really dynamic, and Singapore has all this nice stuff. Why don't we copy their branding strategy? Okay, that's probably going to fail because it lacks an original, authentic sense of place, right? So if you're talking about place branding, you should be thinking about, like in tourism, we talk about sense of place. What is the landscape? What is the real landscape? The other problem that happens in place branding is if we are Koreans branding Korea for the international market, we will say, what do we as Koreans like about Korea? Okay, well, actually, that nobody cares what Koreans like about Korea if you're not Korean, right? What you want to know, so that's if you're talking about place branding, you have to be thinking about target marketing. What do Indonesians like? What does our big market, our big four, right? China, what does China like? What does Japan like? What does USA like? What does Taiwan like? Taiwan is a big market, or at least used to be. Okay. So, in terms of these things like tourism imaginaries and affordances, we have to think about what people like. If you walk around Seoul, you realize that Japanese love to go to Namdaemun Market. And a lot of these vendors in Namdaemun Market, they speak a little bit of Japanese. If you go to Myeongdong, that's where Chinese go. Go to Itaewon, that's where the Americans go. So even in terms of place branding, the idea of kind of a universal brand is not very effective. That's also why you see, usually tourism destinations have what they call a slogan. Like the old slogan for Korea was like land of the morning calm. And then there was like dynamic Korea and these things. The slogan has to be exciting, but it has to be vague. It can't be too exact. Otherwise, it's going to push some people away and only attract a few people. So place branding has to be very vague. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of your question is, think back to what Professor Gu was talking about in terms of a Mercedes-Benz, right? The thing that makes Mercedes-Benz such a successful brand is its iconic features and its quality, right? But it's not for everybody. It's good features also work to exclude a lot of people from ever purchasing.
Okay. Good. Next
Thank
question.
you.
Thank you.
Professor, I have a question about the concept on destination imagery. I also think the destination evaluation or perception will differ depending on the personal threat or experience or other information source. However, as you know, many quantitative research have developed the many measures for destination imagery, but there is a question of whether these attempts are fit to apply at this point. Because, for example, although events such as Itaewon incident and COVID-19 are a big event, but it affects the destination imagery, but there are no measurement items to apply to this situation. So I would like to know your opinion about the research on the destination imagery as a quantitative approach.
As a quantitative approach. As I mentioned at the early on in the lecture today, and I also mentioned this in my graduate courses, I strongly suggest especially to students, to avoid the notion of quantitative or qualitative. Avoid them because they are, although there are many books and articles on quantitative and qualitative, unless you really understand what the narrative is about, you are misleading yourself. For example, if I am employing semiotics and I employ a content analysis, is that quantitative or qualitative? Is content analysis quantitative or qualitative?
I think it's qualitative, but it's quantitative.
Guess
right?
what? Guess what? You're counting. I have
Counting.
16 birds. I have 18 cats. I have
Uh-huh.
9 dogs. What is it? Is it numbers? I'm counting, right? So there's a quantitative sense to it. And so what you're really saying, usually when people talk about so-called quantitative is they're talking about the employment of certain statistical procedures. But you could employ certain statistical procedures in a qualitative context, right? So what I think you're really trying to ask is an event like what you're really trying to ask, and I might be wrong, what you're really trying to ask is what is the real impact of something like what happened in Itaewon? Okay. And in tourism, there is this thing called kind of a collective memory. So for example, COVID-19, it's been around for like 2.5 years now. And as I mentioned, there are real quantifiable effects.
Okay.
It's quantitatively, right? Empirically changed the behavior of people, the expectations of people, maybe the values and beliefs of people. Now, what happened in Itaewon, although it was terrible, people died, for the families of the people who died, right? That's life-changing thing. But for you and me, yeah, at the time, yeah, I remember checking my smartphone. Oh, wow, people died. Oh, wow. Guess what? Today, I haven't thought about it since, right? It's a terrible event. It happened. Guess what? Let's talk about a period of 2 to 3 years. Guess what? Nobody will remember it. So in other words, the reality, and we can go back to the thing that we were talking about earlier, from a semiotic point of view or a destination image point of view, does it really change what Korea is? Nah, not really. Think about all the big disasters back in the 1980s. I can't remember the name of it, but the collapse of a department store. The Daegu, was it Daegu or Daejeon, the subway fire? Terrible thing. How many people remember it? Even the Daejeon Expo that happened in like 1993 cost a lot of money. How many people remember? Or the Olympics, who remembers? So what is the real effect of an event over time? From a colder point of view. So, and that kind of comes back to the first question that was asked about brand image, right? So if you're going to brand Korea in a certain way, you have to make sure that there's a certain robustness to the products that you are branding. Otherwise, if there's something it comes and goes, and people forget, then it's a waste of your investment to use that as part of your destination product.
Okay, and next.
Professor Hunter, could I ask a question?
Yes.
Thanks for giving us very insightful lecture. It really makes me recap when I learned about cognitive psychology.
Thank you.
Yeah. Semiotic research could accommodate to the behavior design to give a managerial implication. Then I would like to ask you which perspective or which theories might be more appropriate, like objectivism or constructivism, or it envelopes large or the theories.
So you mentioned behavioral psychology. Is that your interest?
Yeah.
Okay, behavioral psychology. Then you mentioned constructivism versus objectivism.
Correct.
Okay, let's go back to the previous question. You're asking something. I'm going to try to reach toward it, and then you got to help me. When people try to divide research into qualitative versus quantitative, they are kind of missing the point, because the deeper level is what we call the divide between constructivism and positivism. Okay, I'm not sure where I'd put objectivism in that, but let's talk about constructivism versus positivism. Positivism is the notion that, or today we basically say neo-positivism, is basically there is a certain and single correct reality. Whereas from a constructivist point of view, we're saying there are multiple truths that we have to, uncover or discover. Okay, so if you're doing, like, let's say a survey, you're designing a survey, a measurement instrument based on survey items. You are designing something that's going to confirm what you already expect. But really, all a survey is doing is collecting opinions. It's only, so you hand out the survey to everyday people, all they can offer you is their opinion. And then you sort those things, and you use various statistical devices to reduce that down to basically what you expect. That's why we use hypotheses to reject or fail to reject what we expect. But in constructivist research, we start out with a mystery, and we don't know what the answer will be. Now, bringing that back to your inquiry based on behavioral psychology, I think behavioral psychology is more of a positivist view on the mind. Don't you think so?
Yeah.
Really?
Oh,
I
yes.
don't agree.
No, listen, if you're talking about like Jungian or Freudian psychology, where you're talking about a therapeutic approach, that's where you have like Gestalt exercises and other kind of things where you're trying to discover what is inside the mind. But behavior is objectively visible, right? If you have like OCD where you have to wash your hands 20 times a day, that's an observable behavior, right? So behavioral psychology is very quantitative. It's a positivist, based on a positivist paradigm. Don't you think so, Ms. Khan?
Yeah, I think I have to study more about it and give some more insights to find it.
Behavioral psychology is best approached using positivist experimental or quasi-experimental design, whereas Jungian psychology or Freudian psychology, of course, comes from a much more constructivist point of view. Now, so one thing I can kind of build on your question is, let's talk about tourist behavior, right? So in terms of tourist behavior, we usually break it down to motivations and decision making, right? And maybe even satisfaction, maybe satisfaction. And then we have certain predictors. But then on the other side of things, we have that question of destination image and its impact. So in tourism, really, everything we do is kind of quasi-quantitative or quasi-qualitative, because we are not a discipline like psychology, just a field of study. Is there something
point
about that?
Thank you.
Oh, I don't know if I really answered your question well.
I just got your point, so.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I like quasi.
Yes.
Quasi-science, National Geographic. Even they sell their product, mountain jacket.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's commercially successful. But they tend to be scientific media, but selling product. Okay, next. One last question or two questions.
Any question is fine. Give us a chance to talk about something else. Talking about semiotics, because I think generally, even though semiotics has been around a long time, a lot of us in tourism don't know about it. And when you read, like even some of my papers, or you read semiotics, it seems kind of hard to do.
Yes.
But don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of it. There's a lot of material, and it's good to explore. It's good to explore something that maybe is not necessarily within your comfort zone. Right? There's so many opportunities to learn in tourism. And that's the beauty of being a quasi-scientific field. Is there's so much to learn, right?
This is a very interesting story. Actually, when I come to this school, the Professor Hunter is the senior professor and colleague. I never read the Hunter's paper at all, but I'm starting point is MIS, and I invented the keyword smart tourism, and I finally touched down to smart tourism design, and I read the article, and then finding out semiotics, and I finding out the Hunter's papers a lot, even though we are neighboring office. I never talked about his semiotic paper since last 9 years. And suddenly these years, I'm crushed on the paper, semiotics and Hunter's paper because of smart tourism design. And I finding out what the stupid I am. The expert stand by me. And I knocked the door. Hey, Professor Hunter, I'm reading your papers and it's so fantastic. Okay, let's work together. Let's work together. So finally, after 10 years passed, and work one paper together. It's amazing. It's amazing, interesting.
Professor Gu, it's kind of like I mentioned earlier in our lecture today about that word convergence. A lot of times, I think I consider Professor Gu to be a very, very good friend, and we're I think very, very close. And yeah, he says, well, I really haven't read I don't really understand what Professor Hunter is doing, right? What is this guy doing, right? And suddenly now it's like, yeah, why? Because as I mentioned earlier, smart tourism has had to have time to develop and grow. And thanks to Professor Gu, right? From the very, very beginning, I remember the very beginning, starting off with the idea and then building to a bigger level and a bigger level, and waiting for the technology. And so I think what's happened over the past year is a convergence. So a lot of times it takes time to have everything in the right place where it makes sense. I'm sure if Professor Gu was reading my papers 10 years ago, I don't think it would be of any interest to him.
Yeah, right.
So, and it's the same, speaking to our students, if you are a graduate student in our university, maybe you're taking a class from some professor and you're just sitting there every day and you're just saying, this is so boring and I wish I wasn't here. And you know what, maybe 5 years later, 10 years later, suddenly all that stuff makes sense. And you say, oh, wow, I get it now.
Okay, right.
I know it's happened to me.
Right.
Looking back, and then suddenly you realize the value of that thing. So a lot of the things that we learn and experience require the right time and place. the right circumstances or meeting the right people, things like this.
Okay, Professor Hunter, we are finishing time 12 o'clock exactly. Today, I am so impressed about your lecture and your deep knowledge of a certain, a theory in the tourism field. And you're the diamond researcher. Okay, everybody, let's great the honorable, clap to him. Thank you very much.
Everybody. Thank you.
Take his class. He will discipline give you.
Goodbye. Thank you, Professor Gu.
Okay, see you soon. And thank you very much. Again, next week we are going to give another great lecture to you. Bye-bye. Have a great Friday. TGIF.